Good afternoon. My name is Bob Orr, and on behalf of the Center for Christian Bioethics at Loma Linda University, I would like to welcome you to our monthly Medical Ethics Grand Rounds. We are particularly pleased today to have a speaker from out of town. Dr. Nigel Cameron is in town, and if I can take just a moment for a commercial break, he's in town for a seminar this weekend entitled Breathtaking Decisions. He's the keynote speaker. I have a few brochures. It's Friday evening, all day Saturday, Christian Approach to Bioethics, being held right here in Redlands. So if any of you are interested, there's still room and time to register at the door. I asked him when he was coming if he could speak to us and could come up with a controversial topic and or title, and I think he did that quite successfully. He's going to talk about, is medicine coming to an end? Let me tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Cameron, as you will learn quite quickly, is from Great Britain and was educated at Cambridge and Edinburgh, where he received his PhD, and his thesis was regarding conservative biblical interpretation compared to higher criticism. Then he spent 10 years as warden of Rutherford House, which is an evangelical Christian ethics think tank in Great Britain. And in 1991 was enticed to come to this country, to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois, just north of Chicago. And he's been there as Associate Dean for Academic Doctoral Programs and Chair of the Department of Systematic Theology, and has just recently been named as Senior Vice President of Doctoral Programs and Academic Planning. He has, to his credit, 18 books as author, co-author, or editor, over 40 articles. He's lectured internationally. He's been very active in the international bioethics community, particularly in Europe. He's a contributing editor to Christianity Today and was founding editor of a journal called Ethics in Medicine, which has been going in Europe for a few years and is just now starting to market in this country. It's an international Christian perspective on bioethics. And of the many books that he has written, the one that I'm most familiar with and have been quite impressed with is entitled Life and Death After The New Medicine, Life and Death After Hippocrates, in which he expresses some major concerns about the medical profession, what is happening to it, what has happened, what the future holds, and it's that he's going to talk to us about. And the other item of significance in his CV is that he is married and has 5 children, and he and his wife and children live just north of Chicago. So join me in welcoming Dr. Cameron.
Thank you very much. It is very good to be here. I must share with you one of my earliest memories of life in this country 3.5 years ago, when I think we've been around about 2 weeks, and I was out doing some shopping in the local supermarket, and the young woman at the checkout was being very friendly and asked me, she could tell I didn't really belong in the Midwest, she asked me where I was from, and I said, I'm from Edinburgh in Scotland, I'm British. And she said, how long have you been here? And I said, just 2 weeks. She said, your English is very good. Well, it remains reasonably good, but I'm afraid I can't say the same for our 5 children. They have settled down very quickly. I was asked to give a stimulating title, and I hope I have done that, and I hope that I will establish some kind of connection between the title and the argument. Is medicine coming to an end? At the heart of the Western medical tradition lies an understanding of the medical enterprise, a highly distinctive understanding of the nature of the medical enterprise as a particular bonding of value and technique, a human undertaking whose humane character has consistently underpinned its engagement in whatever options of technique have been open to it. It is that fact which accounts for the identity of our medical tradition, and I think one can argue that at whatever length is required. So that physicians, whether ancient or modern, indeed physicians modern in an institution like this one, and in very primitive medical contexts, physicians laboring in those dramatically different context of technique, have nevertheless understood themselves to be engaged in a common task. And back of that, it is, of course, the marriage of value and technique, so recently a seeming indissoluble union in the practice of medicine, which has located this identity in what we have come to refer to as the professional character of medicine. It seems to me that the historical perspective on the rise of medicine in the ancient world, its more recent history, the themes of value and technique bonded together, and the question of medicine's professional character are all interlocked in this understanding of the nature of the medical enterprise. Now, we could say much more, of course, along that line. It could be argued that medicine is both historically and ideologically the cradle of the idea of a profession. So we aren't so much speaking, as is customary, about medicine as one of the professions and about the professionalization of medicine in modern history. We are speaking about medicine as the archetype of the idea of the profession. And we would tie that understanding in to the way in which moral vision and technical competence were bonded together in the ancient as well as the modern medical enterprise. We could pursue that line of argument. We might wish to add to the account of the professionalization of medicine in the modern world what I would want to make of a more radical case for the identity of a profession, in which its modern characteristics, in the way in which a sociologist will detect them, have their rooting in a moral dynamic which existed long before particular patterns of fee-for-service and so on developed in the course of the 17th, 18th centuries, depending when you want to begin reading that history. We could indeed address the distinct resonance between the idea of a profession and such characteristically Christian commitments and ideas as the vocation and notions of service. And of course, the resonance between the idea of the profession and the Christian commitment to the transcendence of any kind of reduction of the relationship of physician and patient to one of consumer and provider. There are various ways in which the argument can be pursued. What I propose to offer is an outline of an understanding of the identity of the humane medical tradition, then to comment on some features of what I take to be its current malaise, and finally to reflect on the future which seems to be held out to us if these trends continue to work in the direction in which they're going, and make some comments about possible responses on the part of those of us who are unhappy with the direction in which events have turned. So first of all, the identity of the Western medical tradition. The origins of what we call medicine lie, as I'm sure most, if not all of us, know well, in a rather curious artifact coming out of the ancient world, which was the adoption of the patterns of Hippocratic medicine by the nascent Christian church. Perhaps it is maybe the most striking item out of secular or pagan classical culture which was baptized into the service of the church in the first centuries. The Hippocratic genius in its clinical form was, of course, allied with the distinct moral commitments of pagan Hippocratic medicine. And for some reason we find it hard to understand, perhaps Christians more than anybody else find it hard to understand, the form of the moral commitments of Hippocratism in, of course, the oath attributed to Hippocrates, that form was simply maintained. You may know there were efforts at revising the Hippocratic Oath to make it slightly less intrusive and offensive to Christian ears with its mention of pagan gods. But they failed. And the great medieval universities of the West employed the Hippocratic Oath as part of their foundation of moral commitment in a context in which, of course, the Church was all-powerful. Now, that is, on the one hand, something of a curiosity of intellectual and professional history. On the other hand, it draws our attention to what lay behind the perhaps curious form of this pagan document of uncertain provenance. Again, some of you will know about this, the endless scholarly debates about Hippocratic origins. But in the Hippocratic document, there is found a moral power, a mesmeric moral authority, which has, until indeed our own time, held sway. One of the interesting features of contemporary medical education, of course, is the way in which medical ethics is and is not taught, and the way in which the Hippocratic Oath is and is not used in the context of matriculation or, now more commonly, graduation. But I think it is very striking that it is still appropriate in medical schools of all traditions and none for there to be a blending of value and technique in this final statement, taking the form of that oath or some other oath or a rewrite of the oath as the apex of preparation for service in the medical profession. Now let me make 2 or 3 comments about what I call the pattern of Hippocratism as this dynamic set of commitments developed in ancient times, and as it has continued to shape the character of the medical enterprise since. First of all, I would ask you to note that the pattern is covenantal. Now, that is evident, of course, in the fact that this is called an oath, so you haven't even got to read it to know that. But it is much more than that. And if this is a document which you read from time to time, or perhaps might choose to read in light of having heard something about it today, the level of ignorance of the oath is very high in the medical profession as elsewhere. What it contains, even though it is, of course, one of the best-known documents in the history of the West. The pattern is covenantal through and through. There is a threefold covenant within the oath in which the physician commits himself, herself, then, of course, himself, to his god or gods. So there's a vertical dimension to the covenantal commitment. And then there are twin horizontal dimensions to that commitment. There is the commitment to the profession, colleagues, and there is the commitment to the patient. And these 3 interlocking commitments form a dynamic context for Hippocratic values, which seems to me to be very striking. And if one spends some time with the document, one discovers something of the ground of what I call its mesmeric power in our medical culture. Because the interlocking of these horizontal, professional, patient commitments with a transcendent grounding in a commitment to God provides an understanding of the nature of the professional exercise, which of course is not negotiable. You can't amend it. The whole thing is interlocked, and you either take it or you leave it. And within the Western tradition, increasingly up in pre-Christian times, and then in the early centuries, almost universally, down to our own time, it was taken rather than left. Some of you may know that within the Jewish medical tradition, there is a very significant resonance with Hippocratic values. Within Islamic medicine, there was a revision of the oath to make it sound more monotheistic, which retains authority within the Islamic medical tradition. This isn't simply a Christian exercise. And the pagan character of the oath and its pre-Christian origins give it a very interesting significance in the contemporary cultural situation as we talk about medical values in the context of cultural diversity. So I draw your attention to the threefold covenant character at the heart of the oath. which offers a transcendent grounding to values and practice within the profession, in the relation of physician and colleagues, and in the physician-patient relationship, which is, of course, the nub of the medical enterprise. One could say much more. As you know, there are within the oath two very fundamental statements about what we now might call medical etiquette, which is what used to be called medical ethics before these big things became open for discussion. In the assertion of the confidentiality, I see in the elevator here you're reminded about patient confidentiality. Well, this was an idea which Hippocrates came up with. Hippocrates even said in the oath, very interestingly, that it wasn't that you simply shouldn't talk about the things that you heard in the privacy of the clinical consultation. He said even things that you heard about your patient in gossip outside, you ought not to repeat. Such was the privileged character of the physician-patient relationship. Second aspect of etiquette, of course, is in the area of sexual exploitation or non-exploitation. And whereas it is still widely held in Western medicine that it's improper to develop a sexual relationship with a patient, in the oath, you were forbidden even to develop a sexual relationship with your patient's slaves. So these are two features of this high doctrine of the privileged character of the physician-patient relationship, locked in to a transcendent grounding in the patient's commitment to his God. And then, of course, we have what we might call the substantive ethical commitments in the oath, which on the one hand are concerned with healing, with the well-being of the patient's interests being paramount, and on the other hand are delimited by the commitments on what we now call the life issues, by the refusal of abortion and the refusal of, in fact, physician-assisted suicide, the refusal of this softest case for euthanasia, which is now becoming a public policy option in the West. These are built in there. And these, again, are locked in the transcendent theistic context within which medical ethics is being developed. Now, it is the case that this covenantal context remains the fundamental understanding which we have of the physician-patient relationship, and more broadly, and this ties into the modern idea of the profession and how the professions have been given inordinate responsibility for their own affairs in Western culture, which is now, of course, being chipped away in many different directions. Also, the implied covenant between the medical community, between the profession and the broader community. There's an analogy there. In fact, it's more than an analogy. There are connections there. Analogical principle working its way out in physician-patient relationship and the profession-society relationship, in which there is inordinate trust built in to the physician as an individual and the profession of medicine as a corporate body, in response, not least, to the transcendent grounding of the profession's ethical commitments and to what I call this indissoluble bonding of value and technique in the way in which skills acquired for medical purposes would be exercised. Now, that seems to me to be one way of offering a charcoal sketch of the identity of our medical culture. There are innumerable connections which could then be unpacked. But with that as the background, I want to make some comments about what we might call our current malaise. Because it seems to me that when one stands back from the detail of the medical enterprise, and indeed from the detail of the bioethics discussions which go on round about it, that the most striking feature of the contemporary medical situation is the step-by-step, systematic, intended or unintended, unbundling or deconstruction of that particular highly distinctive medical vision, which has, very curiously, continued down to us to this day. That remains the default understanding of the medical enterprise. But it is so less and less, and it is so less and less because of course, the broader social, cultural, religious, philosophical changes which have taken place round about us. This isn't something which doctors have done. this is something which has impacted the profession, impacted it late and slow, but impacted it nevertheless, as broader social changes in social mores have come to bear on the values of this distinct and conservative community within the broader culture. We could pick a number of things which demonstrate, I think, the unraveling of this seamless dress of Christian Hippocratism. We could refer, of course, to the physician-patient relationship, which is at the heart of the tradition, which remains at the heart of medicine properly practiced, and which increasingly is in jeopardy from all sorts of pressures. Pressures, of course, from the attempted substitution of autonomy / adversarial models of the relationship of physician and patient, which seem to me to be necessarily contractual, and which seem to me to imply an understanding of that relationship which is unrealistic. I understand there to be an inherent inequality in the physician-patient relationship, which can never finally be resolved into sort of analogies of commercial exchange. We have instead to develop appropriate models which will recognize the inequality in the relationship and will constrain the physician and the patient in such a way as to ensure that medicine is practiced in the interest of the patient. A radical autonomy model seems to me to fail to do that. But that is, of course, still the standard alternative to what I think are often overdrawn models of Hippocratic paternalism. Paternalism can mean many things, and I think here it is being used as a cover for good things and bad. But that is surely the most striking development in our generation in the way which we model the physician-patient relationship. We could relatedly comment on the deprofessionalization, which is perhaps more candid, in a consumerist reduction of the relationship. Now, that needn't go alongside the autonomy approaches, but often it does. And the fact, physicians, generally speaking, have been rewarded reasonably well for their work. That isn't the point. But they have been rewarded in a context which transcends a consumerist reduction of their service and their fee. A second aspect of the malaise to which we could draw attention relates to the abandonment in tandem both of any substantive ethical commitments in medicine as being somehow inherent in medicine. And this comes back to my title. It seems to me that medicine cannot simply be redefined in a way that it avoids this marriage of value and technique. But in tandem, we see the abandonment of the idea that there are substantive values here which are required for there to be the medical enterprise, rather than something else. And, of course, the abandonment of the specific moral commitments of the tradition. And the two central commitments there, of course, are in the area of abortion and euthanasia. And those now, of course, are major points of division within the profession, as well as within the broader body politic. And the historical significance of that change within the medical culture seems to me to be very striking. Thirdly, we could make a different kind of comment and refer to the way in which the healing commitment within the tradition is increasingly being supplanted by a model of medicine as manipulation. Manipulation which might well be in order to healing, but which might equally be for other purposes, which examples, of course, are crass cosmetic plastic surgery. I'm not saying all cosmetic surgery is in this category, but crass surgery for merely decorative purposes. Another example would, of course, lie in certain uses of in vitro technology. If you want to have a Nobel laureate as father of your baby, that kind of thing. I think we have here examples, concrete examples, of medical technique being used in a way which has lost the analogy with medicine. But of course, when we begin to look at abortion and euthanasia options in this, from this perspective, you see that manipulation rather than healing, if you're looking for an overarching category for what is going on, you can contain all of these within a manipulative framework. Only some of them now conform to the commitment to heal. Those are three headline ways of identifying major challenges to the identity of the tradition. Well, let me thirdly, before we open up some interaction, make some comments about the way I see the future. And I think it is important, and this may be the kind of contributions a non-medic makes in this situation to those who are much deeper involved in the professional and clinical components of medicine. It is of crucial importance that we stand back and that we gain an historical perspective, that we put what is taking place in our medical culture within the context of what is taking place in the broader culture, which is, of course, of historic significance. This is the end of Christendom, the end of this culture which has taken its point of departure in a default acceptance of Judeo-Christian public values and all that kind of thing. And here we have, in the context of medicine, in some ways the jewel in the crown of that culture. We have the impact of those same destructive and disorientating cultural forces being brought to bear on a highly specific professional context. As we look at the future, I think we will see a growing redefinition of medicine, or attempted redefinition of medicine, in these terms, in terms of autonomy, in terms of consumerist reduction, in terms of a manipulative understanding, in terms of all those things. I think we see them all at work now. I think we will see them increasingly candid, increasingly acknowledged and intentional, as they are often unintended and hidden from view in the way in which people seek to define medicine. I find it interesting in a medical school context, meeting students who come in and students who are graduating and talking about how they found their experience has shifted over those years. I was in a very similar context in a secular institution quite recently, and someone stood up at the end of the meeting, and I was speaking about a related theme, and he said, well, it's very interesting, looking at the difference between the students as they come in, with, even in that context, some kind of idealism, commitment to a caring profession, all tangled up with other motives. And he said by the time they leave, they've sorted it out, and that has gone. And I think there are many indications of this sea change taking place in the nature of the medical culture, which are matters of some concern. But with that, with increasing candor, with an increasing refocus in the definition of medicine, with, it seems to me, increasingly the end of our distinctive medical culture and its replacement with something else, I think there will be an increasing role for what we might call dissident medicine, for medicine which harks back to the tradition, which seeks to approach the new questions, and of course there are extraordinary new questions, building on the basis of the strength of the medical culture which has come down to us, instead of abandoning that culture and looking for a new basis out of which to approach these new questions. A dissident medicine which offers an alternative to what increasingly will be a consumerist understanding of the enterprise, in which human values are paramount, and in which the business dimension, as with indeed the autonomy elements, form consent elements in the relationship, are transcended by a commitment to healing and a commitment to the patient's good. The opportunities for that kind of thing in the next generation, I think, will be very great. And I think there will be opportunities, institutional and individual, for those in and around medicine, which they may find hard, not least because of the very conservative character of the medical enterprise, which I believe increasingly will seek to conserve itself in a very different direction to that of the tradition, and in which being a dissident will become increasingly hard, even if the only dissent one wishes to register is in behalf of the tradition of the profession itself. I was interested reading The Economist magazine just a few weeks ago. I was reflecting upon this topic, which I had hazarded over the phone, I think, to our colleague. And I picked up an article entitled "Why Doctors?" And I thought, here I am being rather daring, saying, is medicine coming to an end? And here the economist, from a very different perspective, was saying the future for doctors looks bleak. That with the technological reduction, with the way in which you can break up the jobs and you can farm them out and you can use the computers and you have these RNs and so on down the line and the HMOs telling you what you can and can't do, with all of those developments being pressed and pressed and pressed in the way in which futurologists believe they will be, what role will there be left for the professional practitioner? I think it is a real question. And it seems to me that those who speak out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, who want to have one foot within the Hippocratic culture, and even as they have another within the new questions being raised, are going to be in an increasingly strong position to offer a distinctive response. Thank you.
We'll have time for questions in just a moment. If I can take the moderator's prerogative for just a moment. When I was studying ethics 4 or 5 years ago, I was particularly concerned about the doctor-patient relationship, and after reading this book and talking with Dr. Cameron, I said, is it really that bad? I mean, are things really changing that much and that fast? And he said, let's try to document that. So I've just completed a survey. Norman Pang, who's here today, has helped me with that. Surveyed all the medical schools in North America to see what oath they are currently using. And we've compared the content of those oaths to the content of the classical Hippocratic Oath. First off, how many schools, how many out of 157 do you think is using the classical Hippocratic Oath? 1. 1 out of 157 is using the classical Hippocratic Oath. Now, there are 69 who are using some version of the oath, but in looking at the oaths that are in use, there's been a marked reduction in the number of content items that were present in the original oath. The original oath had 14 identifiable measurable items. And as new oaths have been introduced from the early 1900s up through the 1940s, 1980s, and so on, each time a new oath has been introduced, there's been a decrease in the number of content items, from 14 to 12 to 10 to 8 to 7 to 6. I mean, it's an absolute downhill progression. So that I think that the claims that are being made are not without some empiric basis as well. Well, comments, questions from anyone in the audience? Yes, over here. David.
Well, I'm going to get back where I can see the speaker, if that's all right. I was struck by your expression, Christian Hippocratism, because I think there would be a number of scholars who would say that's an oxymoron, that we really in the West have two moral traditions in medicine, one reaching back to the Greeks, the other reaching back to Jesus and the Jewish heritage, and those ought not to be so easily collapsed onto each other, and that what we have in the West is an ongoing tension between those two moral traditions. Now, those persons, I think, would agree with many of your concerns about the present situation, but they might look upon the end of Christian Hippocratism the same way a lot of us look upon the end of Christendom and say, thank God it ended. That medieval synthesis of Greek and Latin and Hebrew values was oppressive. It was destructive. It was contrary to human freedom and dignity. I think there could be a lot of people who would express themselves along those lines. How would you respond to them?
I think at some length. I know there has been an argument made that these are two conflicting traditions. I think I would want to answer more in terms of the term you used. You talked about the medieval synthesis of classical and Judeo-Christian, which wasn't always a happy synthesis, but it was indeed it was an intended synthesis. It wasn't simply a containing of contraries. There was a building of common ground which remained at the center of a whole civilization. And I think that is what's taken place within the medical culture. And I don't doubt that if we were sitting down, I mean, I have written elsewhere on a question of a theology of medicine, and I think there are very distinctive Judeo-Christian perspectives in terms of death and resurrection. The resurrection of the body as a central theological locus in medicine, I think is of enormous importance. Now, you don't get that out of Pythagorean Hippocratism. But it does seem to me that the reason why, if we can look at this after the event, the reason why both the early Christians who came in touch with us, and of course who wanted to get rid of so much of even the good that was in paganism because it didn't fit, they found this fit rather well, and therefore that it was a public tool for distinctively Judeo-Christian vision for medicine. And I think the very fact that it survived and became the basis of the great medieval medical schools, despite its overt paganism, is an amazing testimony to how good the fit was. Now, I don't doubt that there are elements that move in different directions here, and that if Hippocrates had been a Christian, or for that matter a Jew, I don't think he would have written quite the way he did. But the centrality of the concern for the patient, these high notions of privilege, focused on confidentiality and sexuality, the commitment to the sanctity of life, which seems to me to be a key Judeo-Christian position, and the idea of the profession as basically a business exercise which was transcended by moral commitment. These seem to me to be have such a happy fit with the Judeo-Christian worldview that I see this, particularly in our current culture. As you say, Christendom is over. And with it, the distinctively Christian hold on public policy and on professional values. But here we have a pre-Christian document, which is regarded as warmly within Islam and Judaism as it is within the Church, and therefore which offers us a point of focus for public and professional values in medicine, which I think it richly deserves, and which has been little in evidence. I mean, something that I have often said and never been contradicted is that when you pick up a contemporary book on medical ethics, one of the first things I do is look up Hippocrates from the back, you see, and he's usually on page 31, and there's usually one reference, or at most two or three. And they say, oh yes, it used to be consensus, those were the old days, Hippocrates began it, it's amazing how long it all lasted, now let's get to business. And I think that is an extraordinary disjunction, in purely cultural and professional terms, in the way in which one seeks to address contemporary questions, given the central cultural significance of that tradition. And Margaret Mead, whom I quote in the book, the great liberal anthropologist, she said this was one of the richest items of cultural inheritance. And I think there's a whole other way of looking at it in which it can be made the focus of our discussion of how we do medicine in the post-Christendom situation. Thank you.
Other questions? Comments? Yes?
You spoke about the future of medicine and how the profession will try to redefine itself in the face of the changes that are occurring, and how people who would be perhaps dissident medicine would be trying to preserve the value of human care over the business aspect. And you said that there would be opposition even within the field itself. And I was wondering exactly what type of opposition do you foresee in the field itself, that type of
Well, I mean, just to give one example, the business question is a sort of, it runs right through all of this, but it's tangential to the moral central values questions. I mean, I have friends who practice medicine in Holland and who do not like the euthanasia regime, which is in operation there. And they are not at the center of professional esteem. Depending how you legislate on euthanasia, you could end up in a situation in which, as I think was being proposed here in the ballot, which was defeated, in which people who were practicing medicine had a legal obligation to refer. Was that not the case? And therefore, they would not have been able in conscience to practice medicine without doing what many of them believed to having some sort of role in abetting homicide. And I mean, it seems to me that you change professional values. The nature of the profession is that it groups itself around its values. And if you don't go with the values, there really isn't room for you. And that is what is happening, I believe, behind a kind of smokescreen of autonomy talk. I think autonomy doesn't work in clinical relationship and in the broader medical culture and society. It is a way people have been talking for a long time now as an alternative to talking about what the substantive values are. You talk about protocols for autonomy in a context of diversity, moral diversity. What takes place in fact behind that, as I understand it, is you have a regrouping of the medical culture around different substantive values. And I think the euthanasia example is perhaps the most evident one of how that already is taking shape in one medical culture and how it could easily have here and may yet here. In terms of the business question, well, I mean, plainly, the conflict of interest issues are now so strong, and this is being recognized increasingly in legislation. But when you have economic credentialing operating, teaching hospitals, medical institutions, depending on the economic credentialing exercises either of themselves or of their managed care contacts. I mean, there are various ways in which the conscientious physician is going to find herself faced with professional questions, not merely personal questions. Can't I do this my way? My doing this my way is going to impact the way we all do it, because it remains externally a professional context of practice. Those sort of issues.
Yes, Dr. Winslow.
I'm interested in the examples, further examples you might give of how these dissidents you refer to might exhibit their protests, and what the chances are that they'd still be paid in an age of managed care. That's one question, but related to it, isn't one of the problems with the Hippocratic Oath that it's really rather highly individualistic? You have individual professionals caring for those in the homes that they go to. And we've arrived at a time where we've just been able to invent so many more things than we can pay for. There have to be some socially responsible decisions about the limits that will be placed on those individual decisions.
Yeah, two questions. I'm asked to repeat the question. I mean, the issue of the further examples of how dissident medicine might operate, and then the problem of our being in a situation in which technological opportunity is now outstripped resourcing, and therefore we have very hard questions to face. I mean, on the latter question first, I think you're right. I think the Hippocratic Oath plainly it's a sort of oath for an itinerant individual physician who has this guild connection, but is nevertheless, the whole thing is focused on the consulting relationship and the individual who's practicing. I think there are many things we might want to add to the oath or take beyond it. It seems to me I think it is a good statement. It seems to me that it could be a better statement, and there are issues which simply didn't arrive in that context. Some of which have been addressed in other contemporary ethical statements, although by and large, I mean, they lose the covenant oath dimension, and therefore they become mere declarations of what we think we should do. And therefore, partly for that reason, they tend to become rather vapid, because they want to include everybody and so on. On the question of dissidence, well, what interests me is that Hippocratic medicine, as we now know in the ancient world, was not consensus medicine. We have inherited consensus Hippocratic medicine until a generation ago. But when Hippocrates and his colleagues, if he wrote the oath, and we don't entirely sure this wasn't in the Bible, I mean, it hasn't got to be true. I mean, when he went about doing this, plainly this wasn't the most popular thing to do. He said there were things physicians shouldn't do. We know there was very widespread practice of abortion and of physician-assisted killing of various kinds in classical Greece. Some interesting scholarly work talking about methods of killing and suicide and so on. There was a major involvement there where therapeutic response wasn't a possibility. These physicians say, we won't do those things. And plainly, if there are things that you won't do, I mean, you aren't necessarily going to be the most popular person around in practice. What interests me, and what I think could be part of the motive force for a new dissident Hippocratism, is that plainly patients came to the view that, on balance, they would rather have these physicians than the other physicians. Because on the one hand, they were making a fundamental moral commitment. They were not practicing merely out of business entrepreneurship. They were practicing medicine in order to fulfill their own moral vision. And B, the particularities of those things they wouldn't do might disadvantage the patient, but in the context in which the physician was committed to the preservation of human life, would be a lesser disadvantage than some of the other disadvantages. And I mean, this is the case. I mean, it was a free market system, and Hippocratism caught on. And I think it might yet. I mean, I was in a different context. Somebody was saying, well, what would you do today if you were rewriting the oath? And I said, well, one of the things you might want to put on the bottom of it, if you're sticking this in your consulting office, and some people do that, is every year I'll publish my tax return. It'll be here on the wall, you'll see. And I'm never going to gross more than 100,000 or whatever it is. I mean, you say, I'm accountable. I'm not in this for the money. I want a return on my investment. I want to take care of my family, and so on. End of the day, I'm in this because I want to help my patients. And it seems to me the physician who did that as part of a package of moral commitments which were given a context in contemporary concerns, that one might well see the beginning of another Hippocratic revolution. It seems to me that much of the economic concern we have in medicine needs to be addressed within the context of the moral vision of the medical community. And given that, then seemingly intractable issues will become tractable, and that the support among patients for a radical view of their autonomy in the consulting situation will diminish. People want autonomy because they don't trust physicians. And as you know the evidence that most people trust their own physician, don't trust physicians in general. If it were the case that people still trusted physicians in general as well as their own physician, I think the pressure to turn this into a sort of consumer kind of relationship, I think would diminish, and we'd be able to talk once again about a covenantal context.
Yes, Dr. Scala.
I'm wondering if you could talk about the implications of healthcare being a right. Rather than a privilege, it is a right which every citizen can demand. Now, because you have that sort of a mindset that it is a right, you move away from the idea of privilege. And at the time of Hippocrates, I don't think it was a right. You would seek to find somebody. You wouldn't just order them and they would be there. The increasing importance of physicians as employees rather than being as practitioners. I think all that contributes to somewhat what you're talking about as well.
The question involves whether healthcare is a right or a privilege.
Yes, my sense is that whether or not healthcare is a right is the wrong question to ask. It seems to me that we have to have a certain view of the universe. We believe there are rights out there to be culled and claimed. And certainly, partly specifically Enlightenment context, the North American public policy discussion, I mean, there are things there which, of course, as in so many of these international declarations in the UN context, I mean, there are statements there which assume certain view of natural rights, which is now intellectually rather passé, and which you can only believe if you happen to take a certain view of how you come to discover what there is out there in the natural order. Now, Christians of a certain perspective may come to those views, other Christians won't, and everybody else will come to their own perspective. So it seems to me that it's become a flag of convenience on which to hang an essential argument about what the community ought to commit itself to. And to say you believe medicine to be a right, people like saying that you've got a right to have a job. Well, so that's to provide the job. I mean, it isn't something out there which you can take off a tree and claim to be yours. This, I think, is a conventional way now of speaking about the obligations we think the community ought to have, and of arguing that this should be among them and not that. It does seem to me that the community, a humane community, will want to do various things for its citizens, its members. But plainly, communities are constrained by many things, one of which is resourcing. And communities are not obliged to do the things that I'm obliged to do for my neighbor. I mean, the community is not a kind of good Samaritan in the sky. I mean, it seems to me this is a false understanding of the nature of the human community, and in particular of the national community. So, I mean, I would say two things. First of all, that I think rights language now, basically, it's a peg on which people hang notions of what they think the community ought to do for whatever reason they hold, religious, political, or otherwise. But secondly, that any notion that we do want to say we have obligations to care for the sick is distinct from my obligation to care for my neighbor, and will of course be constrained by what can and cannot be done by the way resources are always limited in a finite world. Broadly speaking, I mean, I come from a European context in which certain healthcare options are taken for granted, and in which there is, at least at a basic level, of course, public and free access to healthcare, but in a context in which there is essentially a capping of total expenditures at around half the level here in North America, and therefore there is rationing within the system. I'd be happier with a more candid discussion of the principles being applied there. They tend to operate bureaucratically there. Here, of course, there are all sorts of accidental factors which enter in. I think the community needs to decide what kind of obligation it wants to have for its people. But I think the rights language really is a cover for something else. And there aren't rights out there to be plucked off trees.
Well, thank you. I think we will have time for one more brief question.
You speak of Judaism basically being paternalistic, and I'm wondering, and the paternalistic approach to healthcare, and healthcare and religion was one of the same in Judaism, as I understand. And now the question is that I would have, and especially in the context of the problems with, say, abortion. Now, the sanctity of human life. With that, we see it in the history of Judaism. The people themselves were not always sanctified, and consequently there was a freedom. The Elijah message: if God is Baal, serve him. If Baal is God, then serve him. There is freedom of choice there, and I see nothing about in Moses didn't do anything to keep the other desanctified, quote, pagans of the world from aborting themselves. It wasn't done in Israel, but it was done among those who were not sanctified and didn't believe. They had the choice. Don't we have the choice? Don't our people? Or do we have to, you mentioned the inequality of relationship. I think it's, I see some conflict in what you're saying, Doctor.
Well, thank you. A question about the way in which, in Old Testament times, the law was for Israel, it wasn't for the nations. This is what you're saying. And does that apply to how you have abortions on today? Well, the nations are roundly condemned by the prophets for their failure, for sacrificing the children to Moloch or whatever it is. I mean, they're condemned for not observing the law. And, of course, that is because it is given to Israel to receive the law of God. It wasn't the law didn't apply to everybody else. It was, they were privileged to be told what it was. I think more broadly, I mean, from my Christian perspective, plainly there are things I can't expect my pagan neighbors to do, and there are things I don't think that the law should prescribe. And we work with a hierarchy. We think people should be free to do many foolish things, but they should be prevented from doing really serious foolish things, especially those which will grossly harm themselves or others. And the most interesting example here, of course, is the question of suicide, which till a generation ago was a serious criminal offence in most jurisdictions. Assisted suicide remains a serious criminal offence in many jurisdictions, and there's a public policy presumption in favour of life. It's very difficult to sue someone if they save your life when you're trying to commit suicide. It seems to me we do have the notion that human life and certain other key values are community values to which we think everyone should be subject, whether they take a religious perspective or not. But these are big questions.
Could I just make one statement? That wine was for the dying in the scriptures, and the problems with the offering to Moloch was when it came into the Jewish culture itself. They were in trouble, and they were brought to judgment for it. The other pagans weren't.
Well, thank you everyone for your comments and questions. If you would like, you may join a few of us who will have lunch in the cafeteria. There are brochures about this weekend conference, and let's thank Dr. Cameron one more time.